Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today we're going to hear about the book. We're going to hear about T. Grace Atkinson, Rad Fem 101, discussed by Marian Rutigliano. So over to you, Marian.
Hi, I'm putting something into the chat. Where did radical feminism come from? I mean, it must have started someplace. The term itself is sometimes debated, and some women who call themselves radical feminists may find their beliefs don't square with the actual analysis that is radical feminism. Radical feminism is not a list of things that you have to believe to be a righteous feminist. It's an analysis. It's the first really feminist analysis of women's oppression. So some women, will listen and say, hey, that's not my radical feminism. Radical feminism can mean a lot of things. Where did you get that from when you talk about radical feminism and so forth? But someone created the analysis that is radical feminism, invented it, as it were. And that analysis has certain defined characteristics. In 1969, T. Grace Atkinson published a pamphlet called Radical Feminism. And the paper later was included in her book, Amazon Odyssey. I don't know if you can see that, which was a collection of essays. And the paper was split into two chapters, Declaration of War, followed by Metaphysical Cannibalism. The book Amazon Odyssey is still available. Amazon Thrift Books, probably a number of other vendors. But the pamphlet itself is also online, and the URL is in the chat for you to download if you want. So let's see what radical feminism is as it was created. First slide, please. And we're going to read the book. So maybe the printing gets bigger later on. I had trouble with the first slide. She says, Alamina Barber, a Black militant woman in Philadelphia, once pointed out to me, the women's movement is the first in history with a war and no enemy. I winced. It was an obvious criticism. I fumbled about in my mind for an answer. Surely the enemy must have been defined at some time. Otherwise, what had we been shooting at for the last couple of years? Into the air? Only two responses came to me. Although in looking for those two, I realized that it was a question carefully avoided. The first and by far the most frequent answer was society. The second, infrequently and always furtively, was men. If society is the enemy, what could that mean? If women are being oppressed, there's only one group left over to be doing the oppressing, men. Ouch. In the first paragraph, we already know this is not liberal feminism. We are at war and men are the enemy. That's not the only place where you can find that. Leah Keith, who's been on here, once wrote a book about state of war, understanding that. Mary Daly, I guess almost 2 decades later, said that women continue to be intimidated by the label anti-male. Some feel a false need to draw distinctions. For example, I'm anti-patriarchal, but not anti-male, or it's society, but not men. But she knew. T. Grace Atkinson knew. So could society mean the institutions that oppress women? But institutions must be maintained, and the same question arises, by whom? The answer to who is the enemy is so obvious that the interesting issue quickly becomes, why has it been avoided? The discussion about this issue, why has it been avoided? That it's men. The master might tolerate many reforms in slavery, but none that would threaten his essential role as master. And again, later on, we see and read Audre Lorde talking about the master's tools, the master's building. These phrases, these concepts came into radical feminist consciousness and using, and this is where it came from. This is where it started. The master might tolerate many reforms in slavery, but none that would threaten his essential role as master. Women have known this, and since men in society are in effect synonymous, they have feared confronting him. Without this confrontation and a detailed understanding of what his battle strategy has been that has kept us so successfully pinned down, the women's movement is worse than useless and invites backlash from men and no progress for women. And again, backlash. We start to build up some kind of power and potency, and there's a backlash. And this is where Susan Faludi got the title from for her book Backlash. But there has never been a feminist analysis. Next slide, please. There's never been a feminist analysis. While discontent among women and the attempt to resolve this discontent have often implied that women form a class, no political or causal class analysis has followed. It just wasn't done up until this point. To rephrase my last point, the persecution of women has never been taken as the starting point for a political analysis of society. Considering that the last massing of discontent among women continued some 70 years from 1850, Seneca Falls, to 1920 when we got the vote, and spread the world, and that the recent accumulation of grievances began some 3 years ago here in America, the lack of a structural understanding of the problem is at first sight incomprehensible. And she talks about 3 years before this. This paper was written in 1969, and around 1965, 1966, there really was all of a sudden a very, very pretty rapid and dramatic change where women started to find their own and say, hey, I'm not sure I want to tolerate this anymore. There's the implication that women are a class, but women have not analyzed all our grievances in terms of a feminist class analysis. Just hadn't been done before. Women who have tried to solve their problems as a class have prepared not solutions, but dilemmas. The traditional feminists want equal rights for women with men, but on what grounds? If women serve a different function from men in society, wouldn't this necessarily affect women's rights? And that word function is going to be very important because this is where she first got to the concept of sex roles and how women's sex roles are somehow connected to them being born female. Traditional feminism is caught in the dilemma of demanding equal treatment for unequal functions because it is unwilling to challenge political or functional classification by sex. Radical women, on the other hand, grasp that some women as a group somehow fit into a political analysis of society, but err in refusing to explore the significance of the fact that women form a class, the uniqueness of this class, and the implications of this description to the system of political classes. If anything, women have resisted and still resist the idea that we are all in a single class and that this is the source of our discontent. This is just what I'm kind of observing about what she wrote. Our discontent, many women refuse to call oppression. Equality, rights, functions, that's sex roles and gender. Radical feminism was the first time anyone saw how this concept fit in a feminist class analysis separate from or just beyond equality and rights. And all right, this is in small print, so it's hard to read. You can tell I need Ben Franklin glasses. Both traditional feminists and radical women have evaded questioning any part of their raison d'etre. Women are a class, and the terms that make up the initial assumption must be examined. Next slide, please. And there really is a resistance to saying I'm in a class, and that's one of the Achilles heels of liberal feminism, is ceasing to see or failing to see that we are part of a class. And that was part of what consciousness raising did, was to, women would hear, oh, it's not just me, oh, it's not just me, on such a grand scale, that women could somehow see them. I am in a class of people who are discontent and oppressed in the same way as I. So the feminist dilemma is that it is as women or as females that women are persecuted, just as it was as slaves or blacks that slaves were persecuted in America. In order to improve their condition, Those individuals who are today defined as women must eradicate their own definition. And she wasn't talking about defined in terms of identity. It's just, do you fit in the class that is women? Women must, in a sense, commit suicide, and the journey from womanhood to a society of individuals is hazardous. So what she's saying is that we are persecuted and oppressed because of our functions as women. Our functions are to bear and raise children, keep the house, provide sexual services and emotional support to men, and so forth. But there is nothing about our status as female human beings, our biology, that means we should perform any of these woman functions. There's nothing to connect the two. The feminist dilemma is what we have, is that we have the most to do and the least to do with it. We must create, as no other group in history has been forced to do from the very beginning. So that realization that the two are not connected, our functions, what have been defined as our functions, our sex roles, are not connected to our biology. But how did the connection happen? The battle of the sexes is commonplace, both over time and distance, but it is an inaccurate description of what has been happening. A battle implies some balance of powers, whereas one side suffers all the losses, such as in raids, often referred to as the rape of an area. If that's happening, that is called a massacre. Women have been massacred as human beings over history, and this destiny is entailed by their definition as women, as our functions, as women. But as women begin massing together, they take the first step from being massacred to engaging in battle or resistance, and hopefully, eventually, to negotiations in the very far future and peace. When any person or group of persons is being mistreated, or to continue our metaphor, is being attacked, there is a succession of responses or investigations. Number one is, depending upon the severity of the attack, the victim determines how much damage was done and what it was done with. We determine that, not the attacker. Next slide, please. Then we want to know, where is the attack coming from whom, located where, how can you win the immediate battle, what defensive measures, why did he attack you, how can you win or end the war, what offensive measures can you take, moving within his boundaries. But look at number two, where the attack is coming from, only ever from one place, from men. This is what she realized, just looking at reality and history. And for the last one, what weapon is the enemy using? Well, the enemy is using, or even number five, yeah. How can we win or end the war? I'm sorry. Winning, and notice she says, winning doesn't mean conquering. It means ceasing to be conquered. We are not looking to, to establish, a society or anything that has to do with becoming what the enemy is. Winning is just ending being conquered, ceasing to be conquered. And then number six, what weapons is the enemy using? We all know that. Gaslighting, negging, emotional manipulation, threats, the use of physical violence. These questions are necessary, but should be considered diplomatic maneuvers. They have never been answered by the so-called women's movement. And for this reason, I think one cannot properly call that movement political. It could not have had any direction relevant to women as a class. So if diplomacy fails, that is, if your enemy refuses to stop attacking you, you must force him to stop. This requires a strategy, and the strategy requires a map of the relevant landscape, including such basic information as who is the enemy, where's he located, is he getting outside support, material, manpower, from what? Where are his forces maintained? What's the best ammunition to knock them out? What weapons is he using? How can you counteract them? What is your plan of attack on him to force diplomatic negotiations? A program of action, techniques. Next slide, please. And she says that, that she's using some military terminology, which may seem incongruous, but why should it? We accept the phrase battle of the sexes. It is the proposal that women fight back that seems incongruous. It was necessary to program women's psychic structure to non-resistance on their own behalf for obvious reasons. They make up over half the population of the world. So without a um, without a programmatic analysis, the women's movement has been as if running blindly in the general direction of where they guessed the last missile that just hit them was based. For the first 2 years of the last organizing, within the previous few years that she mentioned before, she says she was very active in this running blind approach. It's true that we were attacking evils, but why those particular evils? What were we attacking when we started? Um, were they the central issues in the persecution of women? There was no map, so I couldn't be sure. But I could see no reason to believe that we knew what the key issues were, much less that we were hitting them. It became increasingly clear to me that we were incorporating many of our external problems, including power hierarchies, into our own movement. And in understanding this and beginning to ask myself some of the obvious questions I've listed above, I came to the conclusion that at this time, the most radical action that any woman or group of women could take was a feminist analysis. The implications of such an analysis is a greater threat to the opposition to human rights for women than all the actions and threatened actions put together up until this time by women. So that was a very profound thing, realizing the need for a feminist analysis as a radical action, and that is the greatest threat to the opposition to men than anything else. Next slide, please. With this introduction to the significance of a feminist analysis, she'll outline what we have so far. And as I mentioned before, the raison d'etre of all groups, I probably said that wrong in French, somebody can correct me, of all groups formed around the problem of women is that women are a class. What is meant by that? What is meant by women and what is meant by class? Does women include all women? Some groups have been driven back from the position of all women to some proposed special class, such as poor women, and eventually concentrated more on economic class than sexual class. But women as a class predated capitalism, predated agriculture, predated anything. Women have always been a class. And if we're interested in women and how women, as women, qua women, are oppressed, this class must include all women. What separates out a particular individual from other individuals as a woman? We recognize it's a sexual separation and that this separation has two aspects, sociological and biological. Sociological is what we would call now a social construct or gender. So she's looking at what defines women. Women are distinct from all individuals. It puts a person in the class called women. All individuals includes men, but there is a separate class among all those individuals that is strictly women. So function, sociological, sex roles, woman, biological, reproductive capacity, which is female. So she goes on to say the term for the sociological function is woman, which comes from with man, wife, woman, it's and all that goes along with it. And the term for biological function is female, apparently coming from the word to suckle, which is a strictly biological capability. Both terms are descriptive of functions in the interests of someone other than the possessor. So a woman in her sex roles as a wife, and nurturing and keeping the house, is the person who gets anything out of it is not so much the women. It's not so much for the interest of women. It's for the interest of someone other than the woman. Same thing with biological functions. In the interests of others, not ourselves, women's roles are not in our own best interests a priori. We may get pleasure from them, but a priori, they're not in our interests. So what is meant by class, she says? Well, we've already covered the meaning as the characteristic by which certain individuals are grouped together. In the women's movement or feminism, individuals group together to act on behalf of women as a class in opposition to the class enemies of women. It is the interaction between classes that defines political action. For this reason, I call the feminist analysis a causal class analysis. We have established that women are a political class characterized by a sexual function. It is clear that women, at the present time at any rate, have the capacity to bear children. But the question arises, how did this biological classification become a political classification? How or why did this elaborate superstructure of coercion develop on top of a capacity which normally implies choice? How did biology become political? How did it become attached to our sex roles? Next slide, please. It is generally agreed that women were the first political class. And then she talks about children not properly constituting a class since their status is unstable. They grow up, they become adults. Political classes are usually defined as classes treated by other classes in some special manner distinct from the way other classes are treated. What is frequently omitted is that political classes are artificial. They define persons with certain capacities by that capacity, changing the contingent to the necessary. In other words, women have the capacity to bear children, to nurture children, to keep the house, but it is not necessary for women to do all that, to be women. But making a political class, by being put into a political class, the enemy says that those things are not just capacity, but that they are required, they are necessary to be women. So this appropriates the capacity of an individual as a function of society, which is the definition of a political class. Individuals grouped together by other individuals as a function of the grouping individuals, depriving the grouped individuals, that's us, women, of our human status. A function of society cannot be a free individual, exercising the minimum rights of physical integrity and freedom of movement. She goes on to say that if women were the first political class, and political classes must be defined by individuals outside that class, who defined them and why and how? It is reasonable to assume that at some point in history, the population was politically undifferentiated. When we think about, was the world's population ever undifferentiated? She goes on to talk about mankind, and she'll use that word, but when she does, it means males and females with no distinction at all. So at some point, was the entire population of the world undifferentiated? Let's call that mass mankind, just a generic word. The first dichotomous division of this mass is said to have been on the grounds of sex, male and female. But the genitals per se would be no more grounds for the human race to be divided in two than skin color or height or hair color. Why sex? Why did that happen? The genitals, in connection with a particular activity, have the capacity for the initiation of the reproductive process. But I submit it was because one half of the human race bears the burden of the reproductive process, and because man, the rational animal, had the wit to take advantage of that. Man in this case means men, that the childbearers or the beasts of burden, in other words, who have the burden of reproductive process, were corralled into a political class, transforming the biologically contingent burden into a political or necessary penalty. Capability of reproductive process, all of a sudden it's necessary, and it puts you in the class of women, thereby modifying these individuals' definition from the human to the functional or animal. Next slide, please. There is no justification for using any individual as a function of others. Where did that come from? I mean, really, where did that come from? Didn't all members of society have the right to decide if they even wanted to reproduce? Because one half of humanity was and still is forced to bear the burden of reproduction, because we can, at the will of the other half, because they think we should. The first political class is defined not by its sex, Sexuality was only relevant originally as a means to reproduction, but by the function of being the container of the reproductive process. So our reproductive capacity as females was turned into a penalty, which she talks about, that did not include us in mankind, but in the separate functional class women. Because women have been taught to believe that men have protective feelings towards women. Well, men have protective feelings towards their functions or property, but other human beings, make sure, yeah, but other human beings, not other human beings. So men have, sorry, again, the printing is kind of small. Men have protective feelings towards their functions or property, but not towards other human beings. And when we think that they're protective, it is protective towards property. We women are shocked by these discoveries and ask ourselves why men took and continue to take advantage of us. Why do they do that? Some people say that men are naturally or biologically aggressive, but this leaves us at an impasse. If the values of society are power-oriented, there is no chance that men would agree to be medicated into a humane state. Why would they? Or how could they? The other alternative that has been suggested is to eliminate men as biologically incapable of humane relationships and therefore a menace to society. I can sympathize with the frustration and rage that leads to this suggestion, but the proposal, as I understand it, is that men constitute a social disease, and that by men is meant those individuals with certain typical genital characteristics. So when she says social disease, you can see later as she goes on that the understanding of it or the description of it really describes male socialization. And that is what the social disease is. She talks about mentally deranged behavior, again, male socialization. These genital characteristics are held to determine the organism in every biochemical respect, thus determining the psychic structure as well. It may be that is in other mental derangements, and I do believe that men have a mentally deranged manner towards women. There is a biochemical correspondence, but this would ultimately be behaviorally determined, not genetically. Again, that mental derangement, male socialization. I believe, next slide, please. So you can follow along. I believe that the sex roles, both male and female, must be destroyed. Not the individuals who happen to possess either a penis or a vagina or both or neither. And she did not believe that that men could become women and women could come in. This is a little sassy comment there. But many men I have spoken to see little to choose between the two positions. She's talking about the when sexual is being described, what we would call gender. And says that men resist that, and that many men feel that without roles, their male role, they'd just as soon die. And you can see that in some men who will say, well, what if you all of a sudden became a woman? It's like, well, I'd kill myself. And I've heard that from men. Certainly it is the master who resists the abolition of slavery, especially when he is offered no recompense in power. I think that the need men have for the role of oppressor is the source and foundation of all human oppression. They suffer from a disease peculiar to mankind, which I call metaphysical cannibalism, and men must, at the very least, cooperate in curing themselves. So the master resisting the abolition of slavery, well, why wouldn't he? Men will resist the abolition of sex roles. Why would they want to change? When we talk about men can be made or educated to give this up. Why would they want to change something where they get what they want? Next slide, please. Perhaps the pathology of oppression begins with just that characteristic which distinguishes mankind, all of us, from the other species, rationality. It has been proposed before that the basic condition of man is angst, the knowledge and constant awareness that he will die and is thus trapped by existence in an inescapable dilemma. My proposal is more fundamental. She's talking about the human fear of death. And remember, T. Grace Atkinson was a philosopher, a political philosopher. So he's talking about some really kind of fundamental, deep things about the human condition. She says that man is not aware of the possibility of death until he, means all of us, is able to put together certain abstractions, description of events with the relevant descriptive connectives. It requires a fairly sophisticated intellect to be able to extrapolate from the description of an event to one's own condition. That is, from another person's experience to one's own essential definition. If instead of asking ourselves what the nature of this distinguishing human characteristic is, we come to a more fundamental question. The distinction between the nature of the animal and human brain seems to be that while an animal can imagine, that is, can mentally image some object before its eyes in some familiar situation, cow can recognize a barn, a dog can recognize a treat, but an animal cannot construct with its imagination. An animal cannot imagine a new situation made up of ingredients combined together for the first time, with each ingredient initiating consequences for the other ingredient to produce this new situation. She's talking about that this is all fundamental to what it means to be human as opposed to some other species. The distinction between the nature of the animal and the human brain, remember, again, animals can't imagine things. They can imagine the treat, but they can't imagine the whole process of, how you make dog treats. Man's rationality, and that's all of us, male and female, is distinguished by its constructive imagination. And this constructive imagination has been a mixed blessing. The first experience of man in his existence is usually called awareness or consciousness. We are sensible. Our senses are operating unrestricted by external coercions, so far as our description is also true of animals. What probably is first known as a distinct thing is our own body, since it is the object most consistently within our perception. I think we can observe our first operation of rationality. We imagine that the second observation has consequences for the first observation. And what she's talking about is that we see ourselves as human beings. And this is all kind of just background to the argument that she's going to go on to make. We see another human being as physically complete and autonomous or powerful, and ourselves as abbreviated and thus incomplete, powerless. And this is like really remember this part. We know this. I mean, we would like to all of us would like to have power and potency, and yet all of us feel powerless in some circumstances. We never see ourselves as fleshly integral units. We feel and sense and analogize that we are each independent units, but we can never completely perceive ourselves as such. Each of us begins with this initial insecurity. Rational action. I think we need to go to the next slide. Rational action or intention requires some sense of individual autonomy to act within the world. We're not animals. To act within the world, to set up a factory, to make the dog treats, or whatever. Rational action, intention requires some sense of individual autonomy. We remember that we are initially insecure. This is early childhood. We don't know what's going on in the world, but we seek to feel powerful with individual autonomy. But we have choice only to the degree that we are physically free. And every man by his nature feels ambiguity on this point. In addition, man realizes early in his maturity that there is an enormous gap between what he can do and what he can imagine doing. I would like to do this, but I don't have the power, the potency to do it. The powers of his body and the powers of his mind are in conflict within one organism. They are mockeries of each other. I can imagine this. Why can't I do it? This second factor adds frustration to the first factor of insecurity. Next slide, please. So we now posit man as insecure and frustrated, okay? And this is man as in mankind. All of us are insecure and frustrated. We want to feel fully autonomous, that we can do anything we think about, that we have the power to do it. But man, as in mankind, has two needs: substance as autonomous body, necessarily outside himself. I can do this. I can make this happen in the real world. And the alleviation of his frustration, which occurs by suppression of feeling through anger, by oppressing other people. That is how anger is expressed. To relieve ourselves, feeling frustration is, I mean, you're frustrated. It's a form of anger. And oppression is a form of anger. So she talks about oppression as anger, part of the human condition of not being able to do whatever you want to relieve this psychic frustration that all human beings have, by not being able to have the power to do what they feel like they want to do or should do. Man feels the need of something like himself and extension. You know, people want to extend their power to outside themselves, to other people, because that's you know, the only source of power really is over other people. This presents a problem since all men suffer the same need. All men are looking for potency, the substantive power to close the gap between their bodily and mental powers. If I think about it, why can't I have it? You know, it seems clear that once the resolution takes the external direction, some men, ideally half, thus one for each, would have to catch other men in some temporary depression of consciousness when matured, rationality of constructive imagination, and at some physical disadvantage. This temporary depletion of self provides the opportunity to simultaneously devour the mind of a member of the selected class and to appropriate their substance to oneself. Men achieve power with the ability to oppress at the expense of another class, in this case, women, since we are the other class. It is this process that I call metaphysical cannibalism. It is to eat one's own kind, especially that aspect considered most potent to the victim while alive, with the victim being the oppressor in this case, and to destroy the evidence that the aggressor and the victim are the same. In other words, as the aggressor to actually see himself as the victim, and we see this in the trans cult, in the trans board calling themselves victim when they have incredible oppressive power, but yet manage to and call themselves the victim, but the reality is that they are anything but the victims. This is a fundamental thing. She saw this. She saw this back in 1969. The principle of metaphysical cannibalism, and this is a very, I mean, it's easier when you read it, and I hope you're reading along. I put the URL early on in the chat so you could download it and reread it if you like. But the principle of metaphysical cannibalism, in other words, destroying the oppressed, seemed to meet both needs of man, to gain potency or power and to vent frustration or hostility. Next slide, please. So while I cannot go into it here in detail, I want to make clear that we must use our constructive imagination to devise a moral alternative. Such an alternative must provide an internal solution to the feelings of inadequacy This solution would probably depend upon just that faculty that initiated the original dilemma, the human imagination. Rationality will here have to construct the substance sufficient for individual autonomy from the inside. This would involve both the problem of substantive incompleteness and the reconciliation of mind and body. The concept we just went through may seem complicated because it is, and it was just pretty incredible that she worked through this, understanding that everybody is motivated by, I want to feel like I can be powerful and potent in the world, that I can, go to school, get a job, that I can make my life what I want to be, that I can feel better, and that being frustrated in this causes this frustration is anger, and anger is only ever really taken out by oppressing whatever we invent as the cause of our frustration. So for men, it's women. So reconciliation of mind and body. Some psychic relief was achieved by one half of the human race at the expense of the other half. That's what we just talked about. Male socialism. How does this persist, though? I mean, she's gonna ask, how does this persist? Think about that. Some psychic relief achieved by one half the human race at the expense of the other. Men neatly dominated men as individual, as men, males, neatly dominated mankind, all of us, by one half when they took advantage of the social disability of those of mankind, women, who bore the burden of the reproductive process. I mean, they noticed this is something we have an edge over. Men invaded the being of these individuals, now defined as functions or female, appropriated their human characteristics, and occupied their bodies. The original rape was political, the robbing of one half of mankind, all of us, of its humanity. The sexual connotations to the term no doubt grew out of the characteristics made later of the men in the original notion, all of us. This rape in its essential features has been reenacted and rationalized and justified ever since. Firstly, those men called women, those of mankind called women, have, I know it's confusing, that's why I'm trying to clarify it as we go along. Those of mankind called women have been anchored to their position as victim by men devising numerous direct variations on women's capture, consolidating women's imprisonment. Secondly, men have devised indirect variations of these variations, what we call class systems, and their supportive institutions are motivated by men's nature, and all political change will result in nothing but other variations on metaphysical cannibalism, rape, until we find a human and equitable alternative to man's dilemma. She's talking about men also setting up other class systems, other, class oppressions, women being the first, and that, that racism and slavery and all these other systems of oppression came later, essentially to normalize what had always been done to women. But the male-female distinction was the beginning of the role system, wherein some persona functioned for others. This primary distinction should properly be referred to as the oppressor, males, and oppressed, female, distinction. The first political distinction. Women were the first political class and the beginning of the class system. Next slide, please. Certainly in the pathology of oppression, it is the agent of oppression who must be analyzed and dealt with. He is responsible for the cultivation and spread of the disease. Still, a question arises. How is it that once the temporary susceptibility to disease, aggression, has passed, the patient does not spontaneously recover? It must be that the external attack aggravates in the victim a latent disorganization which grows and flourishes in response to and finally in tandem with the pathology imposed from outside. she's kind of talking about, it's called a positive feedback loop, and you see that in medical, in physiology, that the negative feedback loop would mean that if one hormone or something is expressed, another one is induced and suppresses and ends things. But positive feedback loops are where one hormone is expressed and it causes other hormones to be expressed that start the cycle all over again at even greater magnitude, so that it just gets worse and worse and worse and more magnified. Positive feedback loop. So that's what she's talking about here. The disease drawn out and cultivated from within can finally maintain the original victim, that is the aggressor, in a pathological state with fewer external pressures. And we see this once a man, we see this in how men need worse and increased pornography in order to get off, and how they need greater and greater violence to satiate anger. I propose that the latent disorganization in females is the same disorganization or dilemma from which males opted for metaphysical cannibalism. The role of the oppressor, the male role, is to attempt to resolve his dilemma at the expense of others by destroying their humanity by appropriating the rationality of the oppressor. The role of the oppressed, the female woman role, is to resolve her dilemma by self-destruction, bodily destruction or insanity. And this is really important. This is why early feminists would talk about, finally realize it's like, you're talking about us like we're crazy for responding to these absolutely untenable situations with anger. You're saying that that's crazy. And it's not. And again, that's why consciousness raising was so important for so many women, because they knew they found out that they really weren't crazy. And that it's not a disease, or it's not craziness to respond to being enslaved by becoming angry. So given an oppressor, with the will for power, the natural response for its counterpart, the oppressed, given any shade of remaining self-consciousness, is self-annihilation. Since the purpose and nature of metaphysical cannibalism is the appropriation of an extension to substance, bodily self-destruction is uncommon in comparison with mental escapes. Again, talking about how women try to adapt and cope with our situation. While men can cannibalize the consciousness of women, as far as human self-construction for the woman is concerned, men get no direct use from this except insofar as they believe it gives them magic powers, but rationally imprisoned must destroy itself. So how does this persist? Well, she tells us. How does the aggressor never recover? Male socialization, positive feedback loop, destroying women's humanity, female socialization, self-annihilation. And through all this, men getting a sense of, she called it magical power. And for them, it really is something so profound and so satisfying in some, pathologic way that they say they'd rather die than give it up. Next slide, please. Metaphysical cannibalism does not solve the dilemma posed by human rationality for either the oppressor or the oppressed. The oppressor can only whet his appetite for power by external measures like drugs to dull the symptom of pain, and thus increases his disease and symptoms. The oppressed floats in a limbo of unconsciousness, driven there by the immobilization of her vital organ, rejecting life but not quite dead, sensible enough to still feel pain. And I want to go back to one of the things, to what she just said about like drugs to dull the symptom of pain. People think that that testosterone makes men aggressive. That's not how it works in the brain. If men are aroused through through social contact with other men, to be aggressive, to attack the enemy, to be abusive towards women, things like that, because of male socialization, if anybody is aroused like that, there is some testosterone that is even with women. There's some testosterone produced that circulates in the body. It is minuscule for women. It is in mammoth amounts for men, and where it goes to is the frontal lobe of the brain. The frontal lobe of the brain is responsible for executive function, for good judgment, for keeping you from jumping off a cliff, things like that. It's responsible for making rational decisions like not running not running in front of cannons. The enemy is firing at you, but testosterone suppresses that function in the frontal lobe. Testosterone works, and I'm not going to go into the into the microphysiology, but testosterone works by suppressing the executive function and the good judgment functions of the frontal lobe of the brain, so that you can get young men when they are aroused and, hey boys, let's go attack the enemy. You can get men to charge into cannons being fired at them by the enemy. You can get them into doing really, really stupid things like jumping off a cliff. Testosterone, it's in massive amounts, and it has a positive feedback effect. Works by getting men who are aroused to aggression by external forces, by socialization, by here's this value, here's what we want you to do, and it suppresses the part of them that would have them not want to beat up their wives, or run right at cannons being fired at them. So that's how that works. And it's, again, a positive feedback effect. For women, and that line just broke my heart: rejecting life, but not quite sensible enough to still feel pain. And again, women in consciousness raising found that other women felt that way. So the whole process whets the appetite of oppressors for more power, which increases his disease, male socialization. The most common female escape is the psychopathological condition of love. It is a euphoric state of fantasy in which the victim transforms her oppression into her redeemer. She turns her natural hostility towards the aggressor against the remnants of herself, her consciousness, and sees her counterpart, in contrast to herself, as all-powerful, as he is by now at her expense. The combination of his power, her self-hatred, and the hope of a life that is self-justifying, the goal of all living creatures, results in a yearning for her stolen life, herself. That is the delusion and poignancy of love. Love is the natural response of the victim to the rapist. And she's not saying that women who are raped love their rapist. In terms of physical rape, she's talking about this pathological relationship between the oppressors and the oppressed, being a political rape. What is extremely difficult and unnatural but necessary is for the oppressed to cure themselves, destroying the female role, to throw off the oppressor, and to help the oppressor to cure himself, to destroy the male role. Now, let's be clear: helping the oppressor to cure himself by destroying the male role is not teaching men to be better. That's not really what it means. It often means applying consequence. Well, it may mean that, but and if you've got a son, obviously you do the best to make him a decent human being. It often means applying consequences for enacting the male role, which is really what the help would be. Think of like the 4B movement. It's going to be a long slog for them, but think of that in terms of applying consequences to destroy the male role ultimately, and female role. Let's see. It is superhuman, but the only alternative. I mean, seriously, 4B and whatever else we do, it's crucial. The elimination of males as a biological group is subhuman. Yeah, we can't just bump them all off. Politics and political theory revolve around this paradigm. this paradigm case of the oppressor and the oppressed, the theory and the practice can be divided into two parts. Those institutions which directly reinforce the paradigm case of oppression, and those systems and institutions which reinforce the principle later extrapolated from this model. We have about 5 minutes left. I don't know if there's any questions. I haven't been able to read the chat because I've been reading. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I'm going to put the, if I can find it, put the link to the paper itself in the chat again. And I am a Luddite, so the link to the paper itself is again in the chat. If there are no specific questions right now, I can reiterate that radical feminism is not a set of rules saying you have to believe this or you're not a radical feminism. However, the analysis that is radical feminism is an analysis. It's not a set of rules. It is an analysis, and that's how she went about it. And the reason why people will say radical feminists say this is because, yes, if you do the radical feminist analysis, this is what you're going to come up with. And this is the woman who created radical feminism as a class analysis. Any questions in the Q&A? I don't see any questions in the Q&A. All right. Yeah, somebody asked if I could put the link. I did. Oh, put the link in the Q&A. Somebody's asking. All right. Let me see if I can put the link in the Q&A.
Oh, Marian, I've done it already. So
You did?
it's in the Q&A, the link
Okay.
for the for the paper.
All right. Again, really classic paper. The link is there. Absolutely download it and read it again over and over again. And again, radical feminism is not a list of you have to believe this. Radical feminism is an analysis. That's what it is. And if you do the analysis, if you go through the analysis, you come up with certain conclusions, and you can do another analysis, but it's not radical feminism. This is what she created and called radical feminism. So
Marian, I've got a question.
Absolutely.
This is Joe. Do you think that she got anything wrong? Like, would you sort of disagree with any of her analysis, or do you think she was pretty much spot on? And when was that? What's the date of this paper? I know you told us. You repeat it.
May of 1969.
Yeah.
Did she get anything wrong? No, I actually think that she was pretty circumspect about some things when she, like, for example, when she talks about, is this biological? Is it social? I mean, if you read you know, Simone de Beauvoir, the beginning of her book, she makes a lot of statements about, well, this is the biology, and this is this, and this is how it works, and Atkinson didn't do that. She was circumspect, I think, where she needed to be. So I don't find anything that I wildly disagree with. I mean, do you, Joe?
Oh, no, I mean it seems amazing, 69. But
Yeah.
then again, I suppose sometimes I read, some of the even earlier people like Virginia Woolf or they're even earlier than that, the Wollstonecraft.
Yes.
They had these insights which were amazing, but this is definitely more modern, isn't it?
It's more
But
modern,
it's
and
fantastic.
absolutely, I should mention that there are absolutely women before her who had insights, that are part of or pieces of this analysis, or pieces of this paper. I think what she did was, was take a lot of that. Remember, she was a political philosopher. Take a lot of that and put it and systematize it into a very coherent, systematic analysis, which had never really been done before, even though a lot of earlier women had a lot of the same insights.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Marian. We've had a very good chat that I'm going to send to you about sport, which probably you haven't read any of the chat, but it was very interesting as well. Your talk stimulated a lot of thinking, which was very good.
Okay,
And T.
great.
Grace Atkinson. Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
See you.